When I visited Paris in 2017, I noticed a lot of people living on the streets and in the subways. Not that homelessness is unusual in big cities, but something about these people stood out to me. They were almost all of Middle Eastern descent. Their clothes were good and they seemed well fed, and their teeth were all white and even, all signs that they had not grown up poor. They were not fleeing poverty, they were running from something much, much worse. In conversations with them, I discovered that they were refugees from the Syrian Civil War, among the 500,000 who had sought safety in Europe. And the 500,000 in Europe were less than a tenth of the total number who had left Syria, seeking asylum wherever they could find it. The Syrian Civil War is regarded as one of the worst refugee crises in history. In this podcast, we will examine the causes of this massive exodus. The Syrian civil war began in March 2011 after the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad responded with brutality against a wave of protest in his country. The roots of the protests were mainly socioeconomic, caused largely by the worst drought the region had ever experienced, but also by unemployment, international sanctions, and the corruption and repression of the government. The protests were influenced by and were part of the Arab Spring, which was a human rights movement spreading across the Muslim world at this time. And the drought, which so exacerbated tensions, was likely the result of climate change. Some speculate that the Syrian civil war is the first case of civil unrest caused by global warming. In any case, Syrian President Bashar al Assad responded to the protests with a brutal crackdown, which in July of 2011 developed into all-out civil war. The Civil War developed into a very complex situation with many different factions involved, all with different objectives. The Syrian government is assisted by Russia, Iraq, Iran, and the terrorist group Hezbollah. The opposition, the rebels, are comprised of many different groups, such as the Free Syrian Army and the Salvation Government, operating with a number of constantly changing umbrella groups and supported by Turkey and, to an extent, the United States. On top of that, the Islamic State, known as ISIS in the US, has taken advantage of the chaos to attempt to carve out its planned caliphate in the region and is opposed by more or less everyone. It was the Islamic State's rise in Syria which brought in the United States, whose primary objective has been to defeat the terrorist group. The Syrian civil war reached a crescendo in 2015, but continues to smolder today as a stalemate between the various sides. This state of apparently permanent guerrilla warfare means that human rights abuses have become a way of life in Syria. Determining the world's worst current human rights catastrophe is a complicated and depressing task, but the Syrian civil war would definitely be in the top five. Although all sides involved in the conflict are accused of human rights abuses, the Assad regime, the government, is said to commit the vast majority of them. These abuses are not merely the works of a few bad actors who are punished when their crimes are discovered. As is often the case, the government systematically carries out these abuses to terrorize the population into submission. Perhaps the most notable of these systematic abuses is the way the Assad regime has treated the medical sector in Syria. The government seems to regard medical professionals as a threat because they will treat rebels and government soldiers equally. Therefore, the regime has made it a practice to raid hospitals and carry off patients they accuse of disloyalty, or even execute them on the spot. Sometimes the military commandeers ambulances, driving the patients to military prisons instead of to the hospital. Sometimes doctors are complicit in this program and will torture or execute patients in the hospital at the government's behest. In other places, the regime attacks medical personnel of all stripes, murdering not just doctors and nurses, but even dentists and pharmacists. Paramedics have been ambushed while doing their jobs. Medical facilities have been destroyed. When the civil war started, there were over 30,000 doctors in Syria. Now there are fewer of half that number in the country, and many of those choose to remain in hiding rather than to risk their lives. The regime's brutality extends to anyone considered to be a possible threat. Members of a minority religion or ethnic group known to harbor anti government sentiments, or anyone living in an area controlled by the rebels. Women and children are not spared the worst of the abuse. Men and boys are often imprisoned, tortured, or killed because the government assumes they pose a threat. This is not an uncommon reaction to a rebellion, unfortunately. The government has arrested over 20,000 people at a minimum, simply because they were suspected of being against the regime and held, often incommunicado, in inhumane conditions. Various abuses, such as rape and torture, are widespread. It is estimated that over 60,000 people have been executed in Syria's prisons during the war. The most infamous of all prisons in Syria is the Saidnaya outside Damascus, where the regime holds thousands of its own soldiers who have either refused to carry out illegal orders or have attempted to desert. Besides arresting and torturing accused rebels, the regime has also used prisoners, including children, as human shields in front of their advancing forces. In one situation, Syrian soldiers had tied children to the fronts of tanks to prevent rebels from shooting at the tank. The Assad regime has also violated the laws of warfare with indiscriminate force, using heavy weapons in urban areas without concern for civilian casualties. This includes the use of cluster bombs, which are munitions dropped by aircraft that spread small explosives over a wide area, waiting to explode as if they were landmines. These munitions are so dangerous to civilians, particularly children, that they are outlawed under the 2008 International Convention on Cluster Munitions. The regime has also been accused of using chemical weapons of various sorts over the years, generally by dropping the weapons from planes. One of these attacks, in August of 2013, killed over 700 people in the town of Zamalka near Damascus. Russian forces assisting the Assad regime are also accused of using cluster munitions and bombing civilian areas. Another war crime of the Assad regime is collective punishment. This is when the government punishes an entire group of people, say a religion or ethnicity, because they were members of that group. Members of that group had committed an offense against the government. In the Syrian case, the Assad government has tried to destroy entire neighborhoods or towns because they were perceived as being rebellious. This is against international law because justice can only be done to the guilty. Nevertheless, the regime has denied food, water, and medical treatment to entire towns, and in one case, at least one case, flattening an entire neighborhood in Damascus with explosives and bulldozers. Finally, the Assad government has weaponized rape in order to terrorize and demoralize the population. Again, this is not an uncommon tactic in war, illegal though it is. It is unknown how many men and women have suffered sexual abuse in Syria, but there are reports of mass rapes carried out by soldiers on hundreds of women at a time. In 2013, the International Rescue Committee issued a report stating that fear of rape is a primary reason Syrian refugees flee their country. Rebel forces in Syria do not seem to practice human rights abuses on the same scale as the government. The rebels have been accused by international observers of indiscriminate killing, kidnapping, and extrajudicial execution, just like their regime opponents. However, the rebels have also been accused of using child soldiers in contravention of human rights law. Hundreds of boys under the age of 17 are said to be used by the rebels for many purposes, including combat. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, unsurprisingly, committed numerous human rights violations in their quest to build their caliphate. In both Syria and Iraq, they killed hundreds of people in public executions. The United States air campaign against ISIS also killed thousands of civilians who were in close proximity to terrorist targets. The Syrian Civil War also induced Turkey to occupy parts of northern Syria, ostensibly to push the Islamic State back from its borders. Long at odds with the Assad regime, Turkey also supports the Syrian rebels. However, Turkish troops also stand accused of abuses against Kurdish citizens in the occupied territory. They are perhaps taking advantage of the situation to clear the area of an ethnic group they've long considered to be an enemy. As of this recording, in May 2022, the Syrian civil war seems deadlocked, with no end in sight. Only two individuals have ever been tried for war crimes, and they were both low level regime members, a soldier and an intelligence operative. Both were arrested after they traveled to Europe and were recognized. The UN has established an independent panel to investigate war crimes in Syria and punish the perpetrators if possible. Assad and his generals realize that they cannot afford to lose the war because they have nowhere to run if they do, with either death or imprisonment awaiting them. That being the case, it seems likely that the Syrian civil war will continue for a long time.